Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So, up until now, we have discussed all of the major components of the prayer. We have spoken about the times of the prayer. We have spoken about the arkan of the prayer. Arkan being those things without which the act does not exist or is not valid. We have spoken about and talked about the sunan of the prayer, and we have spoken and talking about the hayat of the prayer. Following that, we talked about some of the differences between men and women, and the logical next step after that is to discuss those things that invalidate the prayer. So I'm just sort of trying to help us also understand the progression of why the books of fiqh are written the way that they are written. This will also help you in your own research in the future, looking things up, or when you come to write your own research papers or books and commentaries, etc., to understand the rhyme or reason. So for today's class, we will look at the 11 main things that invalidate the prayer. There are a little bit more than 11. I might make reference to a couple of them as we go along, but these are the 11 main things that if they are done in the way we will describe, they will invalidate the prayer. Of course, in some of the Shafi'i books, the numbering is different because like eating and drinking is considered one act, but in our book, it's considered two separate acts because they are in fact two separate acts. But all of the fuqaha agree that if you eat or drink on purpose, it breaks your prayer. So that's why sometimes you find the different enumeration. Following that, we are going to look at what might be a little bit odd, but he enumerates all of the components of the prayers. So how many rak'ahs are in the day, how many sujood are in the day, how many ruku' are in the day, how many tasbih are throughout the day. If you pray all of the prayers on time every day, not including Jummah, because Jummah has the Dhuhr prayer is 2 rak'ahs, not 4, of course, and not including if you are a traveler in which you would do the qasr of the prayer, you would reduce the rak'ahs. That will come, all of that will come later. But he enumerates them. And one of the reasons he enumerates them is that this is an introductory book, so he presents the material in another way for the young student to memorize. And then following that, for today's class, we will look at inability. People that are unable to stand. And remember, we said that the rukn of standing, and we talked extensively about that. In the fard prayer, it's a rukn. And here he's going to talk about what if you're physically unable to do that, what are the other modes that you can say your prayer, here talking about the fard prayers. So these are the subject matters, inshallah, that we will discuss in today's class. So as is our habit, let us look at the Arabic text first. So he says, قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين فصل في مبطلات الصلاة والذي يبطل الصلاة 11 شيئا الكلام العمد والعمل الكثير المتوالي والحدث وحدوث النجاسة وانكشاف العورة وتغيير النية واستدبار القبلة والأكل والشرب والقهقهة والردة. فصل في عدد ركعات الصلاة وركعات الفرائض 17 ركعة فهي 34 سجدة و94 تكبيرة و9 تشهدات و10 تسليمات و153 تسبيحة وجملة الأركان في الصلاة 126 ركنا هي الصبح 30 ركنا وفي المغرب 42 ركنا وفي الرباعية 54 ركنا ومن عجز عن القيام في الفريضة صلى جالسا ومن عجز عن الجلوس صلى مضطجعا. This is the section. Let us read the English quickly and then go back to our Dalil book. 11 things invalidate the prayer. Number 1 is intentional speech. Number 2 is excessive motion. Number 3 is ritual impurity. Number 4 is the occurrence of filth. 5 is the exposure of one's nakedness. 6 is a change in intention. 7 is turning away from the direction of prayer. 8 is eating. 9 is drinking. 10 is cackling or laughing, might be a more appropriate translation. And 11 is apostasy. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. Following that, he has the section quantity of prayer elements. There are 17 obligatory rak'ahs, which contain 34 prostrations, 94 occurrences of Allahu Akbar, 9 tashahuds, 10 sayings of Assalamu alaikum, 153 sayings of Subhana Rabbiyal Azim or Subhana Rabbiyal A'la. There is a total number of 126 integrals during these prayers, 30 during the Fajr, 42 at Maghrib, 54 during the 4 rakat prayers, that being noon, mid-afternoon, and the night prayers. And then the last section for today is inability. Anyone unable to stand during the obligatory prayers may pray seated. If unable to sit, one may pray lying on one side. Now let us look at the dalil regarding al-kalam wal-amd, speaking on purpose. We have the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, that we used to say salam to the Prophet ﷺ while he was praying, so he would respond to us. So when we came back from the Najashi, we said salam to him while he was praying, and he did not respond to us, and he said inna fi salati shughlan. So this is something that would have changed, a ruling that would have changed. And then another hadith on the same subject is Zayd ibn Arqam. He said we used to speak during our prayers until it was revealed, verse 238 in Surah Al-Baqarah, حافظوا على الصلاة والصلاة الوسطى وقوموا لله قانتين فأمرنا بالسكوت. And after the revelation of this verse, we were ordered to remain silent. These two hadith can be found in Bukhari. Okay. As far as changing of the niyyah, well, no, that's not the one I wanted to talk about. SubhanAllah, those are the only dalil he has listed. Okay, for that section. Now the enumeration is the enumeration. That doesn't need a lot of talk. But let us look at praying lying down. We have the hadith of Abu Hurairah that's narrated in Bukhari, that the Prophet ﷺ prayed with us Dhuhr and Asr, and then he did salam. Oh, this is misprinted in this book. That's what I was looking for. This is the hadith of Dhul Yadayn about speaking in prayer. So the Prophet ﷺ prayed Dhuhr and Asr. There's a difference in the narration, 2 rakahs instead of 4, and he did salam. So Dhul Yadayn said to him, فقال ذو اليدين الصلاة يا رسول الله أنقصت. Has the prayer been shortened? The Prophet ﷺ turned to the companions and said, أحق ما يقول? Is it true what he said? They said, نعم. So the Prophet ﷺ stood and he prayed the other 2 rakahs. This narration that I just read is in Bukhari, but there are other narrations, and this hadith is going to be very important when we talk about the speaking without intention as an invalidation for the prayer. It is based on the hadith of Dhul Yadayn. Okay. As far as the lying down, going back to that, this is the hadith of Amran ibn Hasin, who we had before, who complained that he had hemorrhoids. So the Prophet ﷺ said, if you cannot pray standing, then pray sitting. If you cannot pray sitting, then pray lying down. Okay, so these are some of the adillah that will cover some of the sections that we are going to take in today's lecture, in today's class. I'm going to just have the hashiyah in front of me, and we will begin our discussion, inshaAllah, of those things that invalidate the prayer. Now, when we talk about the things that invalidate the prayer, that these things that we are going to discuss, when they are done on purpose or when they occur in the manner in which we will describe, at that moment the prayer is invalid. Batalat as-salah, so you have to re-enter into the prayer. Okay? The first one is intentional speech. Intentional speech, kalam al-amd. Any speaking, any two letters put together that come out of your mouth on purpose invalidates the salah, invalidates the prayer. So there can be no speech in the prayer except that those things that are meant to be in the prayer, like the recitation of the Quran, Allahu Akbar, the tasbihat, etc. If there's a qunut, dua al-qunut, if you're in sajda, dua, things like that. Those are the things that can be used in the prayer. But you cannot speak on purpose praying. So a lot of the examples that they'll give in the books is that if a young person is praying a fard prayer and their parents call for them, you can't say naam, yes, or you can't respond to it, because that responding would be a on purpose speech that would cause you to exit, cause the prayer to be invalid. Now, if your parents were screaming and something was wrong, you could get out of the prayer altogether and go and see what's wrong. That's another thing altogether. Here we're just trying to give an example that explains the situation that we're in. So any type of sound that comes out that can be called words, that would invalidate the prayer. What is not would invalidate the salah. What does not count is like if you're crying because you're hearing the recitation of the Quran, or you're smiling because there's a passage or a verse about the Jannah or something like that. Those type of sounds are not words. That's okay. That does not invalidate the prayer. But what invalidates the prayer is speaking on purpose, which leaves then what happens if you speak not on purpose. And that's where in the previous, just a few minutes ago, I mentioned the hadith of Dhul Yadayn. The fuqaha of our madhab have determined that speaking 6 words or less without intention does not invalidate the prayer, because when they put all of the riwayat of the hadith of Dhul Yadayn, they discovered that the Prophet ﷺ when he was conversing with Dhul Yadayn, he did not speak more than 6 words. Now, of course, the Prophet ﷺ had done salam, so in his mind he had finished the prayer. So the Dhul Yadayn is, aqasarat as-salah am nasit. That's another riwayat. Is the prayer, has it been shortened or did you forget? And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Kullu dhalika lam yakun." All of that did not happen. None of that happened. And then he said, some of it happened. Sadaqa Dhul Yadayn. So he stood and prayed, ﷺ, meaning that the Prophet was not intentionally speaking during this time with the purposes of speaking during the prayer. So based on this hadith, if you speak less than 6 words unintentionally in the prayer, then the prayer is not invalid. So the hadith of Dhul Yadayn, therefore, is very important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's the hadith that we use for the dalil on being able to speak 6 words or less unintentionally in the prayer. And number two, notice how in the book that I was reading from, that was only one narration. And now when I'm narrating to you the story, I'm even giving you another narration. There are multiple narrations of the hadith. So therefore, when you are confronted with a situation like this from the point of view of istidlal, of trying to find the dalil for a ruling, you need to put together all of the proof texts together. You can't just base it on one, you found one reference to the hadith and not the others. You need to make the effort to look at all of them. Okay. So we talked about speaking on purpose versus not on purpose. Okay, and then the next thing is excessive motion. Excessive motion automatically means that there's something called unexcessive motion. So major moving and minor moving you can think of. Major moving is that you move one of your limbs, like you take a step with your right foot. So excessive movement is considered 3 consecutive movements or more. So let's say that I'm praying and then the space in front of me opens up. There's a gap, so I need to step in front to fill that gap. But I've already started the prayer. So if I move my right foot and then my left foot, that's 2 consecutive movements. I would pause and then my right foot and my left foot, again 2 consecutive movements, but I paused then until I get to that spot if the spot is very much in front of me. In other words, if I move 3 or more consecutive large movements, that would be considered an invalidation of the prayer. So if I'm praying and then I move my hand like this, that would be considered 1 movement, and coming back would be 2 movements. That would be okay. So if I had like, I had like an itch on my nose or my eye, and I was praying, and I could go like this. This is considered not excessive movement. This is not considered excessive movement, but this is considered excessive movement. And walking, of course. So what invalidates the prayer is 3 or more consecutive large movements. But if you split up those large movements, 2 and then paused, 2 and then paused, 2 and then paused, the prayer would not be valid. It would not be invalid. But the small movements, it's just makruh, it's just disliked, but it doesn't invalidate the prayer. Now, this is important. The example I began with about the filling up the gap, if you pray in large masajid, like when we have our class at Al-Azhar, or we used to pray Jummah at a mosque called Sultan Hassan in downtown Cairo, which is a large Mamluk mosque, or one of these great jamas that exist in the Muslim world. When the Imam says Allahu Akbar and starts, and then you start, sometimes the rows are still getting filled up because mashallah the mosque is so big. So it's very possible that you've started your prayer thinking that you're in the row, and then by the time he's about to get to ruku'ah, you have all of these gaps because people kept moving forward. So you need to step up and fill up those gaps if you can, and that's how you would do it without invalidating the prayer. So excessive movement, again to repeat, is 3 or more consecutive excessive movements. But if they were 2 and then paused, 2 and then paused, you could still maintain within the framework of the prayer. And of course, this does not contain minor movements like moving your fingers, something like that. Okay, and then the one after that, number 3, is ritual impurity, al-hadath. So, if you are standing to pray and you pass wind, or urine comes out, or feces comes out, the things that we've talked about, the hadath in the book of Tahara, the presence of those things means that you have gotten out of the prayer. Even if you had no water and no earth to make tayammum, faqad at-tahurain, and you prayed out of necessity and you broke your wudu, well, you don't have wudu in the first place, but the mas'ala is, and even if you did something to cause a hadath while you are praying, that prayer would be invalidated. You would have to pray again. So the presence of a hadath in the state of prayer breaks the prayer. One assumes usually when you're standing to pray, you either have wudu or you've made tayammum. The situation when you're faqad at-tahurain, when you don't even have water or tayammum, that's extreme. Obviously it's an extreme example, but he's in the Hashiyah showing you this example, giving you this example to show you the importance of the relationship between the hadath and the prayer, that when hadath occurs in the prayer is invalid, even if you didn't have wudu for that extreme reason. Which, as I said, is a very rare circumstance. I understand that. Okay. And then the occurrence of filth, huduth and najasa. Occurrence of filth, we should say, that is wet. That would be maybe a qaid, that would be a description of this ruling. Meaning that if I was praying outdoors somewhere and there were birds flying over and the birds pooped on me, several of them, several droppings. So I have gone beyond the excusable amount that's on my body, and it's, sorry to be disgusting, but it's wet. So we said that wet najasa transfers, the wetness of the najasa transfers the najasa to the object that it's on. So if I was holding a child while I was praying and the child peed and the urine came on me, the urine obviously is wet, or the feces of the child is wet in its first occurrence, and therefore I have now, najasa has come on me. At that moment my prayer is invalid. I have to get out of the prayer to clean myself. But if for some weird reason, let's say dry najasa came on you, you were praying outside somewhere and there was a car that was, or a donkey cart or something was passing by the street, and it kicked up some dung that was dry, some horse dung, for example, that was dry, and that kind of flew on you, and you just, kind of wiped it off you like that. Because it was dry, it did not transfer the najasa to you, so therefore you could wipe it off right away, and then your prayer would not be invalid. So whenever we talk about najasa, it's important to remember the category of dry and wet najasa, because that will solve many of the problems and the confusions that sometimes can occur. Okay. I feel there was something with the najasa I wanted to say. Or maybe it was a previous. Okay. Well, I'll just keep going. And then he says, rahimahullah, exposure of one's nakedness, meaning one's awrah. So, if you are praying, of course, we said that one of the conditions for the prayer to be valid is that for both men and for both women, their appropriate awrah must be covered. Now, what if like I'm a man and I'm wearing a shirt and trousers, and whenever I go to make ruku'ah or sujood, sometimes part of my lower waist or my buttocks is showing. So the minute that is shown, the minute that or like a gust of wind comes and moves my clothes around such that part of that awrah is exposed, the minute I feel that, if I quickly go and I cover it, then that would be okay, my prayer is not invalid. But if I was praying the whole prayer and there was that gap that was always there, and it was just not, I was not even aware of it, that would invalidate the prayer. That's what he means by exposing one's awrah. The example that he gives of the wind is an exact example. In other words, if somebody came by you and exposed your awrah, for whatever weird reason, that would invalidate your prayer. But if it accidentally was exposed due to something like wind, meaning accidentally that the person, if a person comes and some of these aggressive videos where Muslims are persecuted, people will go up to women and they'll pull off their hijab. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. That would cause the prayer to be invalid, because the person chose to do that and could have chosen not to do that. But accidental exposure like wind or making the movement of the prayer, things like that, in which there is no irada, there is no rational decision on the actor causing that, that is where it is excused if you can capture it quickly and cover the part that is to be covered. So when we talk about covering the awrah, it's important for both men and women to make sure that they have appropriate clothes readily available for when they pray. Because sometimes, unbeknownst to you, you could have part of your nakedness or your awrah being exposed for prayer after prayer, and then that could put you into some difficulty as far as the prayer is being valid. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, and then next he says, changing of intention. Changing of intention. So, including in the intention to leave the prayer. So, if you're standing and praying, and you said, I'm going to pray dhuhr, and then you start praying, and then you're like, I really wanted to pray asr, or I really wanted to pray a sunnah, you can't, that change of niyyah invalidates the prayer. So you start the prayer with one niyyah and it continues for the rest of the prayer. So there's no changing of the niyyah inside the prayer. And as I said, just to repeat, included in this would also be if you intend to leave the prayer, then at that moment you have left the prayer and the prayer is no longer valid. Turning away from the direction of prayer, the qibla. Remember we talked about the definition of the face, and then facing the qibla, we have like a 40-45 degree discrepancy possible. So if you move the qibla straight, and I moved such a way that this was what was facing, or my back, khalas, then I'm not facing. The obligation to face the qibla in prayer is no longer there, and at that moment, therefore, my prayer would be invalid. What's a more realistic example of this is if you are praying on a traveling vessel. a boat or a train or a car or something like that, in which a large truck, in which there is change of direction. So if you're praying thinking that you're facing the Qibla, and then at some point the vehicle or the vessel moves such that you're not facing the Qibla, at that moment the prayer is invalid. The only two prayers that we have in which facing the Qibla is not a condition is the prayer of extreme fear, which we'll come to talk about later inshallah in this chapter, and also the Sunnah prayers that we talked about. But when it comes to the Fard prayers, we have to face the Qibla. Okay, eating and drinking intentionally, a little or a lot. So anything that has to do with food. So even if you had food or drink left in your mouth and you started to pray and you swallowed that, that would invalidate your prayer. Which is why part of one's wudu and prayer prep should be ensuring that the mouth is clean and that there's no loose food in the mouth and things like that, because that could, as he says, that could invalidate the salah. So you can't eat or drink, whether on purpose or by accident, in the prayer. Unlike the siyam, if you ate a little bit by accident while you are fasting, your fasting will still be valid. However, if you ate or drank a little bit by accident while you are praying, that would invalidate the prayer, because the thinking is, or the logic is, that the prayer is such a limited thing with limited motions and limited specific time, that therefore it is so specific that anything other than it would invalidate its act. Laughing or cackling, such that you make a sound like that, you make a sound. But if you smiled because you had a nice thought, or you read something, you heard something beautiful in the prayer, or you understood a beautiful meaning from the recitation, those things, and you smiled and you just had the facial gesture of the smile, that would not invalidate the prayer. But what would invalidate the prayer is the sound that comes from laughing. Okay. And then the last thing is apostasy. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. If somebody decided for whatever reason, as they started praying, that they're going to leave Islam, well, then the prayer is no longer valid, because we talked about in the very beginning of the prayer, there needs to be, one of the prerequisites is that you're a Muslim. Okay, so that would not work. Okay, so these are the 11 things. Now there's a couple of things I want to add. I forgot to mention as we were going, but let me add them. Is that if you prolong a pause in the prayer, one of the hayat, unnecessarily long. So for us as the Shafi'is, we said that when you get up from the second sujood, when you get up from the second sujood, Allahu Akbar, to stand, we sit for a pause and then we stand. That sitting, if you prolonged that, then you would have invalidated the prayer. So that's one instance where the hay'ah can be turned into, if it's prolonged unnecessarily. Okay. Quantity of prayer elements. I'll just read them again, but I don't think there's much really to comment on that, because it's just a numerical addition of all of the things. 17 rak'ahs, the 2 of Fajr, and the 4 of Dhuhr, 4 of Asr, 3 of Maghrib, 4 of Asha. Those are 17 rak'ahs. They have 34 prostrations. They have 34 sujood in them. That's 2 sujood per rak'ah. And then 94 occurrences of Allahu Akbar. Here he's taking into consideration all of the sunan and the hayat. So in the numbering of the prayers, he's not talking about the rukn only, he's talking about the whole thing. And then 9 tashahuds. The reason it's odd is because we only have 1 tashahud in Fajr prayer, whereas in the other prayers we have 2 tashahuds each. And then 10 sayings of Salamu Alaikum, 10 because there are 5 prayers, and each prayer has 2 salams at the end. One is the rukn and one is the sunnah, or one is the hay'ah. So again, in his numeration, he's the assumption is that when you pray, you're going to pray with all of these things. But we talk about them in different categories in the fiqh so we can understand the fiqh behind it. And there's 153 sayings of Subhana Rabbiyal Azim and Subhana Rabbiyal A'la. And then another thing he says is that there is a total number of 126 integrals in these prayers. Here are the arkan, 30 at the dawn, and then 42 for Maghrib, and then each 4 rakat prayers has 54. Okay, so this is another way of just helping the student understand. I mean, chances are if you're taking these courses, you're older, you don't need to memorize those numbers. What you need to know is the differences between the arkans, the sunnah, and the hayat, which I hope in the way I presented it is inshallah clear. Now the last thing for us to discuss is inability in the prayer. Now one of the things that the section on inability underscores is how important and sacred the prayer is. In other words, there's almost no circumstance that one can think of in which a person doesn't pray, other than a woman who has her period, but that's it. I mean, even in the thick of battle, in extreme fear, even when there's a drought, even when you're tired, even when you're hurt, even when you don't have limbs, I mean, the list goes on and on. That's how important the prayer is. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said a hadith which means there is no good in a religion. La khayra fi din la salata fi. There is no good in a religion that has no prayer in it. So prayer is the cornerstone act of Islam, which is why it's in the very beginning of the fiqh book, and why tahara comes before it, because tahara is necessary for the prayer. So even though this discussion will be very short, keep in mind how important that prayer is. Now, when he talks about inability, we're talking about physical incapacity. I am physically unable to stand and pray because of some physical, I'm sick, God forbid, or something happened to my body. Now, the reason he doesn't talk about the inability to do ruku' and sujood is that the chances are if you can't do the qiyam, you can't also do a full ruku' and sujood, and you will be modifying those as he's going to describe as well. So that's why he doesn't isolate the other movements, but he's like, the qiyam is the big movement. So if you can't do the big movement, then this is how you can modify. So and again, as I said, these are for the fard prayers. The sunnah prayers, you can pray sitting down. Even if you are able to stand, you get less of a reward for it, as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in the hadith, but that's okay. But what you have to stand for, if you physically can stand, you have to stand for the prayer. Anyone unable to stand, so now we know what unable means. Unable is physically is unable to stand. During the obligatory prayers, may pray seated. So you can, like I'm seated now, face the qibla and pray. And if you cannot pray seated, then lying on one side. So even if you can't sit up, then you would pray lying on your right side. If you can't even do that, then the book will say, praying on your back, meaning, and if you can't do that, then you would just run the prayer over your heart. If you can't even pray with your eyes, then you would run the prayer over your heart, the movements. Meaning that there is going to be almost no circumstances when we don't pray. But there are some times in our lives, unfortunately, when we're sick, we're not well, in which we have to pray modified. And alhamdulillah, we have the flexibility. The hadith about the prayer not counting or counting less, as I said, is for the person who is praying the sunnah prayer. But the fard prayer, for the person who is in need of praying sitting down or lying, etc., their reward, inshallah, is not diminished. Okay, let us go over what we took in today's class. So we began today's class by talking about those things that invalidate the prayer. In our book, we have a list of 11. I might have added one or two, here and there. And we talked about in the beginning how some of the fuqaha of the madhab considered eating and drinking as one act. Even when we discussed it, we almost discussed it as it's one act, but they are two separate things. And because this is an introductory book, Abu Shuja radiallahu anhu likes to keep things very simple and fully enumerated so we can keep things clear in our mind. So these things we talked about, now there are nuances to these things, because some of these things, if you do them with intention or without intention, it invalidates the prayer. Some of these things require intention to invalidate the prayer. There's dispensations if some things happen by accident. So, you'll have to go back and listen so you can get those details. and remember what we talked about. And then we moved from there to talking about the enumeration of the prayers, which is a feature of this being an introductory book. And in the first enumerating of the rak'at and taslimat and tasbihat and takbirat, etc. in the prayer, Qadi Abu Shuja radiallahu anhu is assuming all of the prayer with this full arkan, sunnahs, and hayat in them. In the second enumeration of the prayers, he talks about the arkan only. And I said, you can memorize them. I think if you know how to pray and if you followed the logic of how the book is being presented and taught, if I were to ask you to enumerate them, you could do a quick addition on a piece of paper and you'd be able to enumerate them. So this is not necessarily the most important thing to memorize. I would focus on just understanding the differences between the arkan, sunan, and hayat. And then lastly, for today's class, we looked about al-ajz, inability to stand. And we talked about how the inability to stand would also extend to the inability to do ruku' and sujood. But the reason he focuses in the text on the inability to stand is that the person who is unable to stand is also most likely unable to do ruku' and sujood. So this is one discussion that encompasses all of those. What if you can't physically do the motions of the prayer? Then you pray how you can pray, whether it's sitting or whether it's lying on your side or whether it's lying on your back or whether it's praying with your eyes or just running the prayer over your heart and taking a moment with your heart to be present with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do the arkan of the prayer. And that underscores for us the absolute and fundamental importance of the salah in our religious system, in our tradition, and how that there's almost no circumstance in which there is no prayer, and Allah ta'ala therefore makes it easy for us to fulfill that obligation. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.